Hi, welcome to this week's episode of In the Hoods. This week we're going to be talking about Soho. Soho is again an acronym which means south of Houston Street. And the official or the original parameters of Soho were south of Houston Street, north of Canal Street, and on the west, West Broadway, and on the east, Lafayette Street. Those parameters have since been stretched east and west a little bit, primarily by developers. I think now Soho goes to Christie Street, and you have an area that's called either West Soho or Hudson Square, which goes west. But Soho now, according to Google, runs to the west all the way to 6th Avenue. The area that I think of Soho is the area which has the historic buildings, the historic cast iron buildings, which have since been designated. This is a historic designation of an area with cast iron buildings, and it's all protected, thank God. But it has a very interesting history. Most of these buildings that are currently there were built in the late 1800s, and they were built for manufacturing. It was lighter manufacturing initially. It was a very vibrant area. Then, as the neighborhood moved north, you also along West Broadway had some of the major retailers. You had Lord & Taylor, you had Constable and Sons, you had Tiffany's. And the area became full of theaters, and with the theaters came brothels. And particularly on the side streets, Soho became known as the red light district of New York. It really declined when those retailers moved north. And the population increased, and everything was moving north. There was manufacturing, there was textile manufacturing. It became an area for printers, and it was active during the day, and then it would shut down at night. It was pretty scary down there. And then in the 1950s, apparently, Soho was called Hell's 100 Acres, which is kind of a scary name. It's the first time I've heard that. I remember in the 1960s when it was beginning to get very fashionable again, with artists, of course. Artists looking for large spaces, big windows, area they could spread out, and these were wonderful, huge lofts. And in the 70s and 80s, many of these loft spaces began to be protected for artists' use only. And you had to prove that you were in the arts. You had to be a fine artist. You could be a writer. You could be a film director. I know because my cousin got one of these lofts, and he was a film director and a script writer. But it enabled people to find large, affordable spaces. It protected the artistic community in New York. And those protections continue to today, which personally, I believe is very important. If we don't have a space for our artists to create, we're going to have no artists in New York City. But there is a huge hue and cry to rezone Soho for housing, to make it easier to build on empty lots, of which there are very few. and make it easier to build affordable housing. I don't know how I personally feel about that. I'd love to hear how you do. Just because so much affordable housing in New York is not affordable, and this could destroy the character of the neighborhood. But as it is now, Soho is coming back. It's changing. West Broadway, which used to have many, many galleries, no longer does. It's now some galleries and high-end retailers. And then the chain stores or the schlockier stores you find on Broadway. But it's become a real tourist destination. So during the summer, be prepared to walk down the street with lots of other people. And then the neighborhood, you know, if we're talking about in the 1600s, again, it was Dutch farmland. And the first people to actually live here came in the 1700s after a Dutch farmer who had the largest plot of land subdivided his property so that people could live. So in the 1700s, you had a large middle-class population. But then there was an issue with stagnant water, and much of this population moved north, and that's when manufacturing moved in. I'm fascinated by all the changes that different neighborhoods go through, and I hope you are too.